All yours, Gary.
Thanks, Sam, and welcome everybody to this week's edition of NPA's Connecting with Nature series. My name's Gary Dunnett. I'm the Executive Officer of the National Parks Association in New South Wales, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we're all meeting on different Aboriginal lands across the state. I'm on Feral lands in the southern part of Sydney, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's quite different to most of the other webinars that we've run. Previously, particularly during lockdown, this was all about being able to provide opportunities for a bit of entertainment and knowledge building about, you know, things like bushwalking techniques. Today's somewhat more somber sort of event in that we have a really, really unusual circumstance where a piece of legislation was put in place for our largest national park in New South Wales, Kosciuszko National Park, which has really profound ramifications for the way that park's managed, particularly in relation to feral horses. And the draft management plan has been on exhibition for nearly a month now. That exhibition period closes next Tuesday on the 2nd of November. And today's really all about just providing information to help our members and supporters who might be interested in putting in a personal submission to that, that management plan. So look, normally I avoid PowerPoint like the plague, but in this case, because there's a bit of sort of complexity to it, this isn't really an off-the-cuff sort of thing. So I'm just going to share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint. And what I'll try and do is not drop off Zoom while I do this. Okay. Now, I'm hoping that, no, don't say remote control. Sorry, I just got to move this bar out of the way. No, I'm going to leave it because I don't dare move the rotten thing around. No. Back to it. Okay. All right, folks. So look, just to let you know, because today is a really sort of nuts and bolts sort of analysis of what's going on with this draft management plan, although we're using the webinar format, so that really only allows Sam and I to talk, please have a look. If you just run your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you'll see that you can bring up two tabs, one called chat and the other called Q&A. If you have any questions along the way, can you please just write them into one of those two, preferably the question and A, and we may leave them to the end, but Sam may in fact just drop me a note to let me know that there's a pertinent, you know, question that's particularly relevant to where we're at in the discussion, and we'll sort of open it up there. Because as I say, this is quite different to the way we've normally approach the webinars. So if you have questions, please sort of jump in as quickly as possible. All right, so look, one of the things I guess that is important, and I've got no way of knowing whether those of you who are out there are actually members of NPA or supporters or simply people who are interested in this issue. So I'm going to presume that you don't necessarily have a deep knowledge of NPA. So who we are is important in terms of it informs the perspective that we bring to this issue. So, you know, NPA has been around for more than 60 years, and at our core, we're all about the protection of national parks and other reserves within the protected area network, their professional management, and in fact, the use of protected areas as one of the core planks of conservation and environmental management across the state, and for that matter, across the planet. So we have the advantage that we get a statewide perspective, but we also have members across the state. And so much of our discussion is actually informed by the personal experiences of those members and the personal knowledge they're able to bring to questions about specific reserves. And Of course, Kosciuszko is a little unique in that I'd suggest there's few members who haven't at some time or another availed themselves of a visit to Kosciuszko, irrespective of where they might live. Okay. All right, so look, as I say, the objective for today is really to help you to make a submission on the draft plan. It's really not about me trying to convince anyone who opposes the notion of feral horse control that you're wrong. We are so far down the track in this debate that this really isn't the forum for a debate. This is a forum for me to share the perspective of MPA on this really critical issue for us. We're not trying to convince everyone. We're just trying to give you our perspective in the hope that there are elements of it you might share and reflect in your own representations to government. And I've got to say that while Kosciuszko is the most extraordinary, fantastic landscape, it's a landscape that's suffering. Feral horses are certainly part of the equation, but they're far from the whole picture. You know, it is a really intensely beset reserve, whether it's from some of the massive infrastructure projects that are happening down there at the moment related to the Snowy 2 program, or whether it's about the commercial aspirations and sort of, you know, urban development that's being proposed as part of the Snowy Mountains regional plan. It's a place that is very much at the forefront of that intersection between community and government aspirations that often have nothing to do with the core purpose of national parks, and our obligation as an organisation to do everything we can to make sure that each and every one of our national parks is actually managed for conservation purposes as the sort of primary goal. So in relation to feral horses, I need to sort of put on the table from the outset that our policy is that effective and humane vertebrate management techniques, you know, control techniques, need to be applied to the removal of all feral horses from all protected areas, including Kosciuszko National Park. So that's our across the board view. We're not prone to magical thinking. We're not of the view that you can get rid of every pest and every weed from every national park in New South Wales instantly, or necessarily in realistic terms ever. But that's the objective. That's what we should be moving to, that these places really aren't about holding populations of feral species. They're for the protection of nature. Okay, so we really do need to start with why this feral horse issue is an issue at all. And I guess many of us would be well aware of the public debate around the impact of feral predators, you know, particularly cats and foxes. And, you know, it's pretty easy to see what's going on when you've got that image of a cat with a rosella in its mouth or a fox with a bilby in its jaws. They're really direct impacts. We can sort of come to terms with why feral predators and national parks are a really poor mix. In the case of grazers and browsers, species like rabbits, goats, pig, deer, camels, cattle, horses, in a lot of ways, their control issues are actually much more familiar to the agricultural industry than necessarily what the community immediately thinks of in protected areas. But the reality is that they can have just as much of an impact on a national park as the cats and foxes. And they do that through a variety of mechanisms. One is through competition, you know, particularly the larger species tend to be much larger, to consume vastly more than their native equivalents, the sort of macropods and smaller species. And they, most importantly, are actually large enough that they modify habitats through their physical actions in the landscape. And species like horses, buffalo, pigs, they combine, you know, behaviours and habitat preferences which are really problematic. They obviously need higher water content, higher nutrient vegetation to actually survive. And so they're attracted to waterways and water-dependent habitats. And when they're there, it's not just the grazing activity that's a problem, but it's also actually the treadage and wallowing. And in the debate around horses, you will have heard much reference to the impacts of hard hooves. But if you want to step back from that, it's really about a big, heavy animal that's actually standing on a relatively small foot, or hoof, toe, in fact, and that where they're moving around those wetter, boggier areas, that has an impact on the soil structure, it has an impact on the riverine vegetation, and it results in erosion and significant modification of those wetland habitats. And of course, there's a whole range of species that are particularly native species that are associated with those habitats as well. So, you know, it's a bit of a disastrous prospect in that respect. If we could turn to the issue then of, well, what's actually happening across the board with managing ferals in New South Wales? So, you know, national parks are not just public lands. They're lands that are set aside for a very specific purpose, and that purpose, you know, the statutory objects for national parks are around the protection of landscape, species, ecosystem processes, and habitats of outstanding value. And there's a positive obligation on government and its management agency, which is the National Parks and Wildlife Service, to address any threats to those core values. In respect to feral species, that means that there's a positive obligation on government, and I'm using it in the broader sort of sense to include NPWS as their sort of agent, to control those species. And they do it in the case of those feral grazers through a combination of fencing, trapping, shooting, poisoning, a whole range of both exclusion techniques, but also lethal control techniques. And the selection of what works best and most appropriately in any situation depends on the behaviour of the species, the nature of the terrain, and of course on the management of visitor and community safety during those operations. Interestingly, across the board, and this isn't just an Australian issue, but you know, across the world, in truth, for protected areas, aerial culling is widely regarded as the most effective technique for larger species, including horses, especially when there's access constraints. It gives a level of mobility. It provides an ability to see what's going on in the landscape, which is just unparalleled. And when you think about it, it actually makes sort of common sense. You're looking from above, you can actually see what's going around. Now, of course, there's active feral management programs for feral species across the protected area network. And indeed, in the wake of the 2019-20 fires, NPWS has never done more feral animal control than they have over the last 18 months, essentially. Much of which has happened through aerial techniques, I've got to say, whether it's baiting or shooting, but that's been happening across New South Wales. The one exception to this is horses. And if we ask ourselves why, I think you can quite reasonably draw a line straight back 21 years ago to Guy Fawkes National Park, where there was a frankly disastrous incident where a horse was shot during an aerial control program and didn't die quickly. And it was a pretty horrible situation. It was found a number of days later. And in the wake of it, there was such a public outcry that the Minister of the day, Bob Debus, actually imposed a ban on aerial shooting of horses in New South Wales protected areas 20 years ago. I'm sure, well, I'd be very surprised if Bob expected that ban to have lasted for the last 2 decades, but it has. And in part, I think that's because there's this almost mythological narrative that's built up around what happened at Guy Fawkes. And certainly if you look at the parliamentary debate, you will have seen that the Deputy Premier has frequently been on the record referring to hundreds of horses that were inhumanely killed at Guy Fawkes. The facts and reality just don't back that up. It was a horrible incident, but it was an animal, not hundreds of animals. But nonetheless, it's created this concern around aerial culling, and it's taken what was the very normalized, a very standard control technique, which is still being applied to all those other feral grazers, but taken it off the board in terms of horses. So, all right, that's just a bit of a background to why this is even an issue. We then need to sort of focus in on Kosciuszko. So what's special about what's going on down in Kosciuszko? I guess one of the things we need to appreciate is Kosci's got a really different history from a park establishment perspective than many, many national parks in New South Wales. Without being too glib, a lot of national parks were left in the landscape and available for creation as national parks because they're the bits that nobody else wanted. They were the bony, elevated, low fertility lands that had tended to be used either as commons or for forestry purposes. But Kosciuszko is not that. Kosciuszko actually had a long period, a long pastoral history, but it was a pastoral history, you know, and it wasn't just pastoral, there was also mining in there and forestry and major infrastructure, but it was a history that actually really destabilized that landscape and had profound impacts that we're still seeing the consequences of that right now. And as a result, for the 70 years since Kosci's been protected, it's actually been a landscape which was in this long recovery. So it's on a somewhat different trajectory than many protected areas. In a lot of ways, it's more akin to some of the former forestry areas or the areas of Western New South Wales that have had really difficult paths, if you like, and they're slowly sort of recovering. But that recovery has been very challenged by a number of factors. And one of those factors is feral horses, because that high country is in fact really good habitat for feral horses, and it allows them to have almost unconstrained population growth in habitats that are unfortunately really vulnerable to that same species. And particularly when you consider that you've got the headwaters of three of our major river systems, the Snowy Murrumbidgee and Murray, all rise in the Snowy Mountains. They're all fed from those water-dependent systems there, and they're a fantastic habitat for feral horses. Now, historically, they were managed up there as an agricultural pest, but in recent years, or recent decades rather, we've seen the management of that species highly contested and politicized. And to be honest, there's a pretty bizarre, in my view, my personal view, there's a fairly bizarre narrative that's been generated by a very selective account of the history of the Alps, by a series of children's books, by poetry that actually wasn't even based in the Snowy Mountains, and this romanticization of that species that it's not something that is, if you're not caught up in it yourself, that it's very easy to understand how people could take that view that would lift that species out of the normal expectations of something that needs to be in balance effectively. And as a result, we had that sort of politicization, and we ended up with a really unprecedented piece of legislation in the Kosciuszko Wild Horse Heritage Act, which essentially said feral horses are going to be treated differently than any other feral species in Kosciuszko National Park. And parks, you're not allowed to apply your normal management arrangements, and you're going to have to come up with a plan to actively manage them that'll need to go through a separate process. I can only imagine the challenge that must have presented for Crown solicitors, the people who actually put together legislation for the New South Wales Parliament, when you've got objects of the National Parks Act, which apply to Kosciuszko National Park, which says this is all about the conservation of nature and natural landscapes, and a political process that was demanding a protection of a threat to nature and natural landscapes. And the solution they came up with was that term heritage in the Kosciuszko Wild Horse Heritage Act, which attempts to put the horses into the context of them being a critical part of our cultural heritage, our shared cultural heritage. All right, I'm sorry, that's a long preamble, but I'm going to now move to the plan. But it is important to understand why this is even an issue for us. So we've got this plan. There's both we and Reclaim Cosy have produced submission guides, which you can go to, and they'll actually give you all the instructions, the nuts and bolts of how to actually put in the submission in terms of going to the portal, which is 3 different ways to access it. One is at the website down here, npws.wildhorses@environment.newsouthwales.gov.au, where you can send in a letter type submission. You can also post it, but please remember that this process closes at midnight on the 2nd. So if you're going to send it by snail mail, you've got to be confident that it'll get there in time. There's also a third way of putting in a submission, and that's through one of those online submission forms. They're always a little bit of a torturous process in that, you know, you can get asked those questions. Do you think Joe Bloggs is outstanding, wonderful, or exemplary? So there's potential for some very leading questions. Fortunately, in this case, though, that there's in fact 4 open questions, genuinely open questions in the online survey that you can use. You're very limited in terms of the number of words you can put in, but they're the ones that I've sort of marked up in bold. So they ask, do you have any feedback on the approaches outlined in the draft plan to protect wild horse heritage values? So we'll talk about that in a moment. Do you have any feedback on the approaches outlined in the draft plan to protect other environmental values, which I'd suggest is the other 99.999% of the values of the park? And do you have any feedback on the control methods outlined in the draft plan to reduce the wild horse population? And then just another one at the end if you've got further feedback. What I'll say is, if you're pressed for time, by all means use the online survey, but there is a very clear greater impact if you can put in a more personalised submission. In other words, a written submission. It's sort of, the online submission, you know, it's sort of human nature, but the agency will go for a very mechanised approach to try and analyse what you've said, and it'll get categorised and, to be blunt, dumbed down to, yep, someone who supports the plan or someone who doesn't support the plan, someone who supports retention areas or doesn't support retention areas, someone who supports shooting, doesn't support shooting. You can give much more nuance and depth to your what you believe by actually writing your own submission, but it's not a, if you don't have the time, by all means, use the online survey. And as I say, what we'll talk about over the next few minutes is really relevant to those as well. All right, so what's in this draft plan? It starts off by asserting that feral horses have heritage value in the context of Kosciuszko National Park. And in fact, it even goes further than that and suggests, doesn't actually provide any evidence for or argue for it, but suggests that there's specific types of feral horses that are associated with certain areas of the park that have heritage value. And they're things like the Kyandra Greys. They're suggesting a type. I'm not even sure what that means. I suspect it's a colour and perhaps a little bit of morphology, but it's certainly not a different species or subspecies. It doesn't seem to have any framing in biological terms, but, you know, they're suggesting that there's types that have heritage value. Now, it's not surprising that NPWS have said this, because they've got a piece of legislation they're working under that says horses have heritage value in Kosciuszko National Park. So no surprise, but I think it's, to be honest, a pretty lukewarm assertion of those values. So that's not such a bad thing. It describes a very small selection of the values of Kosciuszko National Park that are under risk as a direct result of feral horses, you know, and particularly focuses on those wetland habitats, threatened species, the soils and geomorphological features, wilderness, sites and places of Indigenous cultural significance, heritage sites, and also visitor amenity and safety. So that's all sort of caught up in a very, very summarised way. You know, the whole plan is less than 30 pages. I've got to say, it's a huge relief after reading EISs that are literally thousands of pages, but so it's a pretty cursory sort of treatment of it, but you know, short and sweet. It estimates the feral horse population and variations in that population across the park. And you know, it's working on a figure of around 14,000 plus or minus 5,000 or 6,000. So it's, you know, it's on within a relatively small range. It proposes a three-zone approach to the management of feral horses in Kosciuszko National Park. And there's a different management arrangement to each of those three. It describes their management objectives, and then it specifies the permissible control measures. So really it's as simple as, yep, there's horses there, there's this many of them. They're going to, you know, they have, it asserts that they have some heritage value in certain circumstances. It acknowledges there's far too many of them, it's having a huge impact, and then says, here's the way we're going to manage it, the issue in different parts of the park. So let's now move to some recommended discussion points, and we'll have these on the MPA website, and also we'll put this online so that you can come back and refer to them as interested. So the first is that, you know, just the point I made earlier, which is that MPWS really had no option but to assess the heritage values of the feral horses to comply with the bit of legislation they're working under. So we shouldn't read too much into the fact that there's that assertion that there is a heritage value. I think it's a reasonable point that the description of heritage, the alleged heritage values of horses in the plan bears little, if any, resemblance to the accepted way we look at definition at heritage in either the general community, the Heritage Act, Parks Act, or any other legislation that I'm aware of. The closest thing you could come to, and certainly in the Heritage Act, would be the concept of movable heritage, which is normally applied to sort of, you know, historic beer bottles and bits of agricultural infrastructure or stamper batteries, not to four-legged animals and biological systems, but nonetheless, they've chosen to apply it to a horse population. Interestingly, when you look at this part of the plan, you'll see that most, if not all, of what's described as the heritage values of feral horses is actually either a reference to the historic domestic horses, domestic stock horses that were used in the high country, or it's actually about the all the equipment and facilities and infrastructure associated with the pastoral industry. So they make reference to stockyards and grazing areas, but they don't actually tie it in any way to the horses. So it's extraordinarily unconvincing. And I think it's quite reasonable for all of us to point out that the draft plan fails to demonstrate that this, these historical aspects of the pastoral history of Kosciuszko are in any way transferred to or embedded in the retention of feral horse herds in the park. And I guess part of this is that if it applies in Kosciuszko, you could make the same argument for, you know, the other 99% of the continent where feral horses are routinely subject to population control. There's nothing that convincingly argues that there's something exceptional happening up in Kosciuszko, certainly not in the draft plan. And I think the final point that we really need to hone in on in terms of the alleged heritage value of the feral horses is this idea that there's specific types of horses in particular areas. The reality is it's not backed by any biological or genetic analysis. And it really appears nothing more than an attempt to manufacture significance through referring to well-known variations in colour and morphology amongst the whole spectrum of feral horses and stock horses for that matter. I don't want to be glib about this, but it does read as though there is this reductionist approach that's trying to make much of small variations that really have no basis in anything other than the most sort of cursory attempt to say there's something special about each of these individual herds and therefore they need to be maintained as is. It's really very unconvincing. So that's the heritage value. So you remember in the online survey, that was one of the major points. The next one of the major points was the way the draft plan grapples with protecting other environmental values. So I think we need to begin with the point that the other values are in fact what national parks are all about. The protection of those other values is the core business of any government and any conservation agency. So this is not a peripheral component of the draft plan. It actually should be the heart and soul of the thing. And the community, both the legislative imperative and community expectation is that those natural and cultural heritage values of Kosciuszko National Park are being protected from feral horses. And the plan, in fact, demonstrates the level of impact that's going on. So we should be strongly endorsing the commencement of a control program. So that's embedded in the draft plan. It's essentially saying there's too many, we need to start reducing it. So that needs to be celebrated, that the worst possible thing that could happen in relation to this plan is that it actually sits never approved on a series of ministers' desks and just get handed into the future. Because if that happens, there'll be no improvement in the control that's going on right now, which is essentially nothing. Yes, there's been attempts to herd and remove from horses, but it's nowhere near dealing with even the natural increase that's happening every year, let alone exerting some positive pressure on that population. So the worst thing that can happen is that we have no change from the current status quo. So we need to actually acknowledge and celebrate the fact that this plan gives the imprimatur for starting the job. My recommendation is that you individually indicate whether you'd prefer that all horses be removed from all parts of Kosciuszko National Park, or whether you're prepared to conditionally endorse a small population within areas, selected areas, subject to, in-field demonstration that they're not having an adverse environmental impact on the park. And that's clearly a task that can only happen once you reduce the population to a much smaller level, and you can do the in-field investigations. But NPA will certainly in our submission be saying we think there shouldn't be any feral horses retained in the park. But you may not be prepared to take that step. But what I would encourage you to do is to link whatever population is retained in the park with a very clear understanding that they mustn't be having an adverse impact on the park. All right. In terms of the three areas, so there's, I thought I had a slide on this one in truth, but anyway, there's essentially three different zones. One of them is referred to as the wild horse retention area, which we'll talk about now, but that's places where they are proposing to allow it up to 3,000 horses to be maintained on an ongoing basis in the park. There's two other zones where the objective is to actually get to 0 horses. The first of those is the areas that currently have no horses or are thought to have few or no horses. And the objective for that is to make sure that they never have any horses in those areas. The second is areas where there are currently horses, and the objective is to get them out of those areas through the control program. So what we're going to start with now are these, what they refer to as the wild horse retention areas. As outlined in the plan, it comprises about 32% of the entire park. So it's essentially a third of Kosciuszko National Park they're suggesting long-term would have horses in it, which, as I've indicated just a moment ago, is not where NPA is coming from at all. But that's what the plan is suggesting. So first up, in terms of responding to the draft plan, first critical issue is that there's nothing in the plan that actually provides any evidence that retaining 3,000 horses in this area won't have adverse environmental impacts. And the reality is that the information provided in the plan gives you lots of reason to think that it in fact will have adverse environmental impacts. We only have to go back to the early 2000s when the population was around 3,000 horses. And the impacts of horses on Kosciuszko was becoming manifestly apparent at that point in time. So we actually had the experience of having seen what the park looks like with the proposed level, and it's not great. It's much worse as it is at the moment with 14 or 15,000 horses, but even with 3,000, it's not great. So it is quite strange that the plan hasn't actually grappled with that question, and that needs to be put on the table. But it's certainly unconvincing that 3,000 is environmentally sustainable. And I'd recommend to you that you insist on further investigation of environmentally sensitive areas within the proposed retention areas, including the headwaters of the major rivers, water-dependent ecosystems, the karst landscapes, so the limestone landscapes, around visitor areas, places of Aboriginal cultural heritage significance. And there's a whole Indigenous values, First Nations values study that's sort of on exhibition at those that you can get to through our website. And of course, some of the historic sites, which we know have been profoundly impacted by horses in those landscapes. So they can't just provide a carte blanche and say, yep, they're fine in these areas as long as they get down to the 3,000. The normal standards of park management, understanding what your threats are and putting in place effective mitigations, have to still apply in those wild horse retention areas if they're to have them. So it needs to do a better job than what's proposed in the plan. Part of that better job, is starting now and ongoing for as long as there's a horse in the park, is active monitoring of their impacts. And most importantly, that monitoring needs to be publicly accessible, both in terms of the data and the environmental assessments that come from it. Excuse me. We're recommending that you endorse the prohibitions in the plan on supplementary feeding, supplementary watering, and most importantly, the translocation of feral horses within the retention areas. And we'd recommend that you check the Reclaim Kosci website for some of their details on the specific areas within the proposed retention areas that really aren't a goer. Excuse me, just losing my voice. All right, finally, the control techniques. It's really important that we acknowledge that the draft plan provides for a significant expansion of the range of control techniques, up to and including lethal controls such as ground-based shooting. So it's not, as I'll get to in a moment, it's not as far as we'd like to go, but it takes it from an entirely pointless exercise, if all you're doing is relying upon trapping and rehoming, into the realms of there's actually some prospect of this getting on top of the rate of natural increase and starting to reduce the population curve. So we need to explicitly endorse the fact that the draft plan provides for a range of control techniques. I think it's really important to emphasize that this is not an opportunity for people to play silly buggers in the mountains. Any management program needs to be a strictly professional one, undertaken by professionals, implemented throughout by professionals. There's no place for things like Brumby running and roping, not just from an animal welfare point of view, but because this is not about creating a recreational resource. This is about managing a threat to the national park, and it needs to be done professionally. There is a really strange part of this draft plan that you'll encounter if you read through it, where they expressly acknowledge that aerial shooting is the most appropriate technique in terms of animal welfare, operational efficiency, and public safety, but then says, but we're not proposing it because government doesn't have the social license to undertake aerial culling. We need to call out the crazy nature of that proposition. it's actually up to government to create social license. The idea that it's something that's going to sprinkle down from them on them from above is perplexing, naive, silly. And the way you create social license is by showing that you can operate professionally, that you can operate safely, that you can achieve a really humane outcome, and that you can actually achieve the environmental outcome that you were after. So social license is not a cloak of invisibility. It is not an excuse for inaction. Social license is what you achieve by doing the job well, by doing the job professionally. We can't let them use it as an excuse for not doing this job in the most effective, sustainable way. It's quite appalling when what they're, social license is becoming code for we'll just do whatever the squeaky wheel tells us and allows us to do. It's really not acceptable. That needs to be called out. And to be blunt, if there's anything that I'd ask you to include in your submission, it's to point to the nonsense, which is their argument around social license. And finally, and to be honest, most importantly, and I'm saying this as someone who's in the past run feral animal control programs in areas right next to communities who are very nervous about this proposition, you need to have the animal welfare agencies involved from the get-go and on their terms. So there needs to be an open invitation for RSPCA, Animal Welfare League inspectors to take part in any of the operations. And I'm really pleased to see that that's built into the draft plan, and it's important for us to endorse that as well. Okay, now I'm just going to, no, I didn't miss any slides. So look, that's, I guess, the end of the formal part of the presentation. I'm just going to stop the sharing. Can I just leave you, before we go to the questions, with a final point, and that is, please don't underestimate the importance of your personal voice in this debate. Government, in all of its processes around public consultation, is playing this really duplicitous game, to be blunt, and that is to use things like online survey questionnaires to try and channel the way we respond to their proposals, but at the same time as being very dismissive of anything that looks like a stock standard response. So you may have seen that, for instance, the independent planning panel, they've essentially said if they get template letters, they'll just consider them as a single submission rather than as multiple submissions. So your personal voice on this, explaining through your submission why this issue is important to you and what you'd like to see happen in Kosciuszko National Park, is really powerful. And the more you can express it in a way that demonstrates that this comes from the heart and that it comes from you personally rather than it's just a ticker box thing, the more powerful that is, the harder it makes it for them to simply dismiss it to an Excel spreadsheet. So you've got to strive for that, that unique voice. And I really encourage you to please take the time. If there's only one issue you engage with in all of that bureaucracy of conservation management over the next 12 months, make it the Kosciuszko draft wild horse management plan. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. We do have a question from Fiona Van Dort. Does the plan consider if there are any special breeds here of some heritage value for pastoral history that could be instead hosted in another area outside the national park? So that goes back to the section on the different breeds that are potentially have some heritage value.
Yep. So the plan in no way prohibits the continuation of the current capture and rehoming program. So that's still on the table. And my understanding is that it's regularly got to the limits of its capacity to even at the relatively low levels it's operated in the past, where it's been hundreds rather than thousands per year. But nonetheless, parks are still free to capture and rehome to the extent that they can find a market for that option. But let's be really clear about this. You know, I haven't unpacked, if you like, the mathematics of this, but to go from that 15,000 odd horses down to 3,000 over the 6 years they've given themselves, if you understand that the horses are reproducing at a rate of nearly 20% a year, the reality is that you need to be removing around 5,000 animals each year to get down to a final population of 3,000. And that's because, you know, it's like compound interest. You actually have to account for the natural increase each year. So that's an extraordinary number of animals to be removing. The equation becomes much better from an animal welfare point of view, from an expense point of view, and from a final outcome point of view, if they can go much harder than that early. But we're talking about numbers that are going to absolutely overwhelm any proposal to rehome. And so, you know, that's why it's so important that they're putting on the table the option of lethal control.
Excellent, thank you. I've got another question from a different Fiona. This is possibly more of a comment, so just to see what you think of this one. So her suggestion or question for, I think, everyone is it possible to ask in submissions for consistent control management with respect to welfare? So consistent management of feral horses, consistent with management of feral pigs and other animals, other ferals.
Look, I'll just comment on that from, I guess, an operational point of view. You have to tailor your control techniques to the different species. And there's different, you know, if you look at New South Wales legislation, different techniques are permitted for different species. So in the case, for instance, of pigs, there are poisons that are actually on label for pig control that are not available for some of those other feral grazers, including horses. I think where the consistency comes through is the provision they've made in the draft plan, which is they have to have those standard operating plans in place. And there has to be the opportunity for the animal welfare organisations to become involved to the extent that they want to. Now, I mentioned that I, in a previous role, used to run a major vertebrate control program, which was for a species called Roosa deer. At the start of that program, we had the RSPCA or animal welfare folk out every single time there was an operation in the park. So, and you know, through time, there's confidence that things are running well, but it's that independent view of what's going on from fellow professionals that is really important. And that's built into this plan, which I find most pleasing to see that in place.
Excellent. Good. A couple of questions here. So, okay, firstly from Sue, is there any basis for retaining horses in repaired stockyards as examples of heritage rather than roaming? So was roaming part of heritage?
Look, I'm sure that there's plenty of opportunities to retain horses in stockyards in places other than the national park. And, you know, one of the questions we've got to ask ourselves is, why are we trying to do a piece of business which is really about the history of pastoralism in a protected area? It's a real mismatch, and it's by no means the only option that this or the Commonwealth government has to provide those sort of experiences to the communities. It's just that Kosciuszko is not the place to do it.
Right. Okay, so there's a comment here from Fiona. Is it worth raising that the horse retention zone in the south overlaps with the existing Bayadbo and Pilot wilderness areas?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? If we think about, you know, Kosciuszko has 7 declared wilderness zones across it. The nature of wilderness zones is that, if you like, they go beyond your standard national parks landscapes as being places that are absolutely representative of those natural ecosystems. And to embed horses in that area, a feral species in that area, is really quite strange. I was quite surprised, and that's why I suggest to people look at the Reclaim COSI website, because they unpack some of those questions at particular locations. I think the other issue for that wilderness area, or associated with that wilderness area, is the question of the headwaters of the Snowy. In my personal view, they should not, even if you're accepting of the retention zones, which we don't, it doesn't make any sense to have the headwaters of the Snowy in one of those retention zones. That should be out of it as well. Even if you're going to go down that model, they clearly need a significant amount of refining, but there's only so much we can do in an hour. I'm sorry.
Yep. So we have a couple more questions about the I guess the difference between, or the benefits, cost benefits versus rehoming to culling. So I'll get the specific one, which is from Lena. What is the cost analysis of rehoming or relocating one horse versus culling one horse? Have there been any costs analysis of that?
It's not in the draft plan. And if you want to see that sort of analysis, ask for it in your submission. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Jeff has made the point that control techniques are a bit beyond the submission, a bit beyond the plan, and that national parks will need to do that currently and in future. So his suggestion is that perhaps control techniques is not a good thing to focus on right now.
Look, I think the thing, though, that's really important is that they're operating at the moment under a combination of the 2006 plan and the Kosciuszko Wild Horse Heritage Act, which essentially constrains them to only doing trapping and rehoming. We know that that's getting, that strategy, if you like, has seen the explosion of horse population through the high country. So the worst possible outcome is that you're stuck with that incredibly limited set of techniques. So it's important to acknowledge that the plan actually allows them to step up to, with appropriate controls, and animal welfare has to be right at the top of that, those considerations. But with appropriate controls, they're able to step up into techniques that will actually start to do the job properly.
Cheryl has suggested it's worth mentioning that Namadgi National Park is a model of best practice compared with, I guess, horse management in COSI. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, Namadgi National Park's not part of New South Wales, so it's not being subject to either this act or the overall prohibition on aerial culling of horses that applies in New South Wales. So clearly there's a very different view has come from ACT government, and I can imagine and understand why they're increasingly cranky about the fact that they're having to deal with the overflow out of poorly managed New South Wales parks. And I say yes, poorly managed purely from the perspective of feral horses. I'm not making a judgment about other aspects of park management.
So rehoming of the feral horses seems to be the unsolvable question. There's been, Fiona wants to explore that a little bit more. If there's not a market for thousands of horses a year to be rehomed, is there really a valid heritage value? And if there was, then surely someone that can afford it should actually pick up these horses and host them.
Yeah, look, I think it's reasonable to say that there's many elements of heritage, where as a community we choose to make a collective investment, through our taxes, through the action of government. None of us has to individually pick up the tab for looking after the Opera House. But the big but here is I've got to say, we at least as in NPA are totally unconvinced by the argument that not so much that the horses have heritage value, but that the unfettered management of a a feral population is required to express that management, that value, sorry. And if we look across the spectrum of heritage management, there's actually a whole range of ways in which places and items of value are celebrated. In some cases, it's by the protection of fabric or even the adaptation of fabric. So, you know, protecting the building, reusing it as a McDonald's or whatever happens down George Street to an innumerable number of heritage buildings. But in a lot of cases, it's about making sure that it's well recorded, that you've actually thought about different ways of explaining, interpreting, describing it for future generations. So that's archival records. It can be off-site representations or protection of a proportion in a different context. There's a whole range of ways that you protect heritage other than saying you need to manage a big feral herd in the middle of a national park.
Excellent. And I think that's probably, we've got one more question, which probably would be a nice way to sum up some of the points you've made today, Gary. And this is from Lena. What is fueling this reluctance to manage horse populations? Is it a cost issue, a political one, or simply government shirking its responsibilities and not prepared to deal with the issue?
I think we almost have to work backwards. So the reality that confronts us right today is, you know, 15,000 horses across Kosciuszko National Park. That is going to require an expenditure in the tens of millions of dollars over the coming decade to bring that into any sort of financially sustainable outcome. This is what happens when you let a problem escalate to such an extraordinary, you know, this is what exponential growth's all about. You know, if you don't deal with it when it's small, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is one of the reasons why we don't have any confidence at all in a 3,000 figure. It's almost the worst possible landing point because it means a really large ongoing program forever. You know, that'll be in the millions of dollars on an ongoing basis each and every year. So there's no question that this is going to be an appalling cost and an appalling impost on the NPWS budget to manage a problem that's escalated to this point. But if we go back to why it's happened, I think there's some local politics, which frankly I don't want to deal with, but you know, we've just gone through weeks of watching what happens when parties leverage off issues of common good and, you know, for their own selfish purposes, particular outcomes get locked in. So, you know, there's some weird stuff that happens here, but I think there's also a strange bit of romanticization that's occurred here. And it doesn't help when you have sort of, you know, series of children's books and poems and all that sort of stuff that get caught up in that romanticization. But one of the things that's hard to unpack is, you know, our relationship to domestic animals is complex and in truth goes back literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. As a community, we accept that we may love we do love our pets, particularly things like dogs, as individuals, but we accept that the agricultural sector has times when wild dogs have an adverse impact on stock, and we accept that they're controlled in that circumstance. For some reason, it's okay for Banjo Patterson to have written about culling feral horses in what's now Kosciuszko National Park. It's okay for it to happen across the rest of Australia, but we have this extraordinary view that it's not appropriate when we come to one of the most vulnerable from an environmental point of view landscapes in the country, Kosciuszko National Park and that alpine zone. And it's not rational. More than anything else, what we need to achieve through this current process is to get back as close as possible to normalising the way we manage protected areas on a day-to-day basis, and that includes appropriate feral animal control programs, appropriate weed control programs, and we need to take this strange pedestal out from under this beast.
Excellent. Thank you. Good way to finish off, I think, today. Thanks very much,
Gary.
Gary.
Way anyway.
And thanks everybody else for coming in today, and thanks for the questions and the comments. I think we might leave it there, and I've put in the link into the chat for the submission guide, so the link to our website, which has the Reclaim Clossie submission guide, so, and some extra notes. So thank you very much, and please get writing. See you next time.
Thanks everybody.